everyone into the room, so please sit tight and we'll get started in just a few moments. Thank you. Thank you everyone for joining us. It takes Zoom just a little while to add everybody into the room, so please sit tight and we'll get started in just a few moments. Thanks. Okay, hopefully Zoom has had time to add everybody into the room. We will go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone for joining us. Welcome to the latest 𝐓𝐡𝐞 media briefing. This one is the first of several over the next few months that will focus on the election taking place in this extraordinary year. I'm Greg Phillips with 𝐓𝐡𝐞 Communications and I'll be moderating this event. North Carolina is touted as a potential swing state this year, with the governorship and a Senate seat also in play. We have three Duke scholars with us today to discuss the state's significance to the national elections and the issues influencing the vote right here in North Carolina. I'll introduce our speakers and get the discussion started, then we'll open it up to questions. We are recording this briefing and that recording will be sent to everyone who registered. Thanks to those reporters who already sent questions. During this discussion, those of you joining us on Zoom can submit questions via the Q&A window at any time. There will also be an opportunity to ask questions in person in a few minutes. Thanks also to everyone watching this on YouTube. With us today is John Aldrich. He is a professor of political science at Duke's Trinity College of Arts and Sciences, where he specializes in American politics and behavior. He's written and contributed to several books, the most recent of which is Change and Continuity in the 2016 and 2018 elections. Good morning.
Good morning. Thanks for having
Also
me.
joining us is Deondra Rose. She is an assistant professor of public policy and political science at Sanford and director of research at Polis. She researches the effects of social policies on the American political landscape, as well as higher education policy, identity politics, and inequality. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Greg. Hi, everybody.
And we have McCorkle. He is a professor of the practice at the Sanford School of Public Policy at Duke and director of the Polis Center for Politics. McCorkle has been an issues consultant to political candidates, state governments, and others for more than 25 years. Good morning to you.
Hello, Greg.
Professor Aldrich, I'd like to start with you. In 2016, polling received a great deal of criticism. Should we be looking to the polls for guidance in 2020, or should we be looking elsewhere to understand how this election might play out?
As a good social scientist, the answer is yes, both. Polls can provide us with a pretty good indication of where things stand at the moment. The big thing about this year as compared to prior years is how dramatic the changes have been month to month, week to week, day to day. And that means that a poll taken today is relevant for today if it's a good poll. But it's not necessarily relevant for tomorrow, let alone next week, let alone a couple months from now at election day. So we need to combine both polls and our judgments about the consequences for other things that intervene in between the polling and the election day itself.
Thank you. That makes lots of sense. And lots to dig into there. But for now, we'll move on to Professor McCorkle. You said back in February that North Carolina is a must-win state for President Trump. Do you still feel that way? And given that the state has gone Democrat for president only once in 40 years, is North Carolina really actually in play this year?
North Carolina is in play this year, but it is a must-win state for Trump. Think about North Carolina. If Biden wins North Carolina, you can think of it as piercing Trump's red wall. It would be the comparable to Trump winning Wisconsin, Michigan, or Pennsylvania in 2016. So it is in play. You're absolutely correct that in federal elections in presidential years, both Senate and president races have gone to the Republicans for a long time, except in 2008. So it's a swing state, but in federal races, there has been a lean to Republicans. And thus, I can boldly predict that if Biden wins North Carolina, you're probably going to see Biden win a lot of other states, swing states, and probably it'll be a signal that Biden will have a big victory. If Trump wins, we'll still, in North Carolina, you'll still have to wait and see what's happening in the other states, especially those 3 Midwest states where he upset Clinton last time.
Gotcha, thank you. And I've certainly got more questions for you on that. But for now, I'd like to move on to Professor Rose. We always hear that young voters have the power to sway elections, but they never seem to cast ballots in large enough numbers to actually do that. With all the activism and stuff going on right now, are there any signs that that will be any different this year?
That's, I think, such an important question because historically, young voters haven't participated at the rates that we might hope. So for example, in 2014, a midterm election, only 22% of millennials showed up to vote. However, in 2018, we saw quite a significant surge in youth voter participation. So that year, a full 42% of young people showed up to vote. And so there are some signs that the contemporary political moment could actually hold some promise for a continuation of that shift. And so a recent poll conducted by the Gallup organization in conjunction with Circle, an institute up at Tufts University, suggested that a full 79% of young adults suggested that the COVID-19 pandemic has really pushed them to appreciate how significant politics is to their lives and how important the decisions that political leaders make are to their lives. And so right now we're seeing a whole lot of engagement in politics. Young people are talking about politics with their families, with their friends at higher rates than we typically see. They're volunteering for campaigns. They're also contributing to money at higher rates than they did in 2016 and 2018. So there's a lot of enthusiasm. And if I were to point out the issues that young people are paying particular attention to, it's really healthcare. They're paying attention to the climate and the environment, and they're also paying attention to racism and racial justice. So I think an important question for us looking over the next couple of months will be whether that enthusiasm and engagement can translate into turnout. That's the big question.
Indeed it is, and I've got some questions for you on that. But for now, I would like to let everybody know that we can open this up to questions. Thanks, panelists, for your opening answers. Zoom users can type a question in the Q&A window or raise your hand in Zoom, and we'll unmute you so you can ask a question that way. If you're calling in by phone, you can raise your hand by pressing *9, and we can also unmute you so you can ask your question. So right now, Professor Rose, I'd like to stay with you. It seems like in the past, there have occasionally been polls that suggested more engagement from young voters. And then on election day, for whatever reason, they just didn't show up. Certainly from what you've mentioned about activism and involvement in campaigns, it seems like that might change. But do you think that ultimately we're just going to have to wait until after the election to see if this is actually going to make a significant difference? Or are there signs that we can really point to?
Well, I mean, I think there are a couple of really big questions that are related to this and that will determine what we see sort of at the finish line. It really will come down, I think, to the extent to which young people have the information necessary to move forward as voters in the midst of a pandemic context that really complicates things. So, studies have shown that when young voters lack the security of feeling like they know what it takes to vote, or that they might, make some mistakes, they don't want to make mistakes. They want some clear information about how to register, how to vote, where to vote. And I think as states are trying to figure out, states like North Carolina are trying to figure out what the election will look like, what early voting will look like, if there will be voting by mail, those are the kinds of details that if the results are not conveyed clearly to young people could actually suppress voter turnout. So I think a priority has to be providing clear information and consistent messages about the logistics of voting for young people.
Sure, thank you very much. And on that topic of COVID as a kind of chaos agent in this election, Professor Aldrich, what do you see as the biggest way that COVID could impact this election? Obviously, there are all these questions about turnout and mail-in ballots. Do you think that, does that invalidate any kind of pre-election prognosticating, because we just simply don't know what's going to happen because COVID is such an unprecedented influencer for the election?
Yes. Everything Professor Rose said about this with respect to youth voting is actually applicable across the board this year because it's totally unprecedented. Changes in how we're going to have to think about the election actually running. So that's true across the board. It's especially true for those who are least experienced, and hence the younger voters, often minority voters as well, learning how to negotiate this process is very complicated, and there's a lot of room for the two political parties, for various other groups and organizations across the country to provide assistance to various subgroups to help them turn out. And if it's done broadly across the range, we could negotiate the uncertainty that the nature of the selection has induced with respect to turnout, in particular, registration and turnout. I should also add, since many places still include voter registration, which is, again, especially important for new citizens and newly eligible to vote, and thus the young people.
Absolutely, thank you. Professor McCorkle, since we're talking about COVID, back before this hit, the governor race in North Carolina was seen as very, very tight. And it seems that, Governor Cooper has generally gotten pretty good numbers for his response to that. How much has that changed the gubernatorial race in North Carolina? Is it still a valid race, and how do you see that unfolding?
It has catapulted Governor Cooper into quite an advantageous situation, given the popularity of his handling of the COVID crisis. And it's really tough for Lieutenant Governor Forrest because there's really not another issue that Forrest can find here. And so if you didn't have the COVID crisis, this might be a much closer race. It's also in general dented President Trump's economic prosperity message, which is the traditional message for an incumbent. And you can tell if you watch the Republican convention, the possible power of just the data, which can be argued about, but the strong economy that we had before COVID. So it's really taken away Trump's main message and left him struggling for a new message, and has also put Lieutenant Governor Forrest into obscurity almost, because you'll look at the Governor Cooper's ads, they're almost like public service ads right now, which is a pretty strong position for an incumbent to be in. There's still a possibility that if and when things tighten at the federal level, they'll tighten some in the Cooper-Forrest race. But right now, you would have to say that Governor Cooper's handling of the COVID crisis has put him in a very favorable position.
Absolutely, thank you. And I'd like to stay with you for a second, but I'd like to get the other panelists' feedback on this too. NBC reported this week that North Carolina's added about 1.3 million more voters to the roll since 2016, and Democrats had an edge of more than 56,000 in new registrations. But there were another 583,000 others who registered as unaffiliated. Now, I know that North Carolina has historically had a majority of registered Democrats, and of course, in the last 20 years at the state level has gone more heavily Republican. What do you make of those numbers? Do you think they're significant? Do they have any bearing on what we can expect in November?
Well, I'm going to defer to my political science colleagues about independent voters in general, but a couple things. In North Carolina, traditionally, and in southern states, people who have filed as unaffiliated have tended to be more conservative than in other states. So you have to watch for that. I do think that the rise of independents, a lot of people will say, oh, well, people will say they're independent, but they'll vote Republican or Democrat pretty consistently, which is true. But I think it does reflect a disconnect with the parties, and so adds to the uncertainty. And then to the certain extent that young people keep, to go back to Professor Rose's point, that young people are especially heavily, more disproportionately filing as unaffiliated. You might think that might be a countervailing advantage for the Democrats because of the young people's support, at least at the college educated level support for the Biden and distrust of Trump. So I still think it's kind of imponderable about the independents. And it's just like Professor Aldrich was saying in the polls, we know how many people, we might know how many people are voting Republican and voting Democrat one day, but it's those undecided, swing, floating, unaffiliated voters, very few in number, but still really important that it's a little bit of an imponderable uncertainty.
Professor Rose, what's your take on that?
I would echo everything Professor McCorkle just said. I think for me, I'm paying a particular attention to young voters and African-American voters in North Carolina. And for young voters under the age of 40 among African-Americans, it's interesting to note the substantial increase in the number who identify as unaffiliated. And I think this really speaks to the fact that, especially for younger voters, they're really eschewing party labels because oftentimes they don't see the Democratic or Republican Party as really capturing their preferences. And so, I think that sends a very clear message to the tops of the ticket, particularly in this case, the Democrat Joe Biden, that they will have to work to turn out young voters of color in particular, who really typically historically have affiliated with the Democratic Party, but are now, not so quick to express that allegiance.
Professor Aldrich, your take.
So if I just jump into one additional feature, one of the consequences of registering as unaffiliated with either the two major parties is that the major get out the vote campaigns in the last decade have become partisan based. And so they tend to focus on turning out their base. If you're registered as unaffiliated, you're going to receive less of that impetus to increase your turnout. And so that induces another level of uncertainty in this. The second thing that it does is that it makes it more possible for the attraction of an individual candidate to make a larger difference for people who are unaffiliated with the parties. And thus, what Mac was saying about the gubernatorial race, that's another advantage for the incumbent, rather than having everybody sorted out into their parties, and so the parties are able to focus on them and sort of freeze them into place.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you all very much for that perspective. Professor Rose, I'd like to come back to you. We've talked about, Professor McCorkle talked about how North Carolina is a must-win state for Trump. What do you see the role of Biden's choice of VP in Kamala Harris? What kind of influence that could have on the election in the state and nationally?
I think that choice was extremely significant. And as we knew prior to Senator Harris's selection, Vice President Biden signaled that he was going to select a woman as his running mate. And so the idea that this recent primary season, especially for the Democrats, started off as a particularly diverse one. And I think for a number of Democratic Party identifiers, seeing the personnel, the headliners at the top of the ticket, their representatives in office represent the diversity of the nation is a really important, it's a priority for many, citizens, broadly speaking, young people in particular. And I think that the selection of Senator Harris was really intended to help mobilize young voters, to help indicate that the Democratic Party is serious about diversity. Senator Harris is a Black woman. She's also a woman of Asian descent. And these are two particularly substantial minority communities in the United States. So I think that what we're seeing is the Democratic Party recognizing the need to really reflect on and respond to the preferences of their base, and to try to really generate excitement and get out the vote among younger affiliates.
Thank you. And Professor McCorkle, following on from that, you said the state is in play, but historically has gone Republican presidential years. What does Biden have to do, the Biden-Harris ticket have to do to win in North Carolina? Where do you think their attention should be focused? What should they be talking about?
Yeah, no, I think it's a national strategy. There's nothing in particular, a North Carolina tailored strategy, especially during the age of COVID, that I think that they could focus on. Ironically, one thing you notice in the numbers is that seniors have not, that President Trump in North Carolina, relatively speaking, is holding on to more of the senior vote than he is in places like Arizona and Florida, at least in a lot of the polling. And so he might have Governor Cooper to thank for that, to the certain extent that Governor Cooper has put more of a lid with his restrictions on the COVID crisis, Whereas in Florida and Arizona, where you had Republican governors, and at least at certain points seem to be spinning out of control. So I think that's an interesting point about North Carolina. Otherwise, the only other North Carolina issue that really may come into play, North Carolina specific, is if there is not another CARES Act, if there's not another unemployment boost. What may become evident in North Carolina is the low amount of unemployment relief that you get through unemployment and the duration in North Carolina. If that becomes an issue, becomes evident to people in the last couple of weeks, especially Senator Tillis is in trouble since he was the author of those unemployment reforms that lowered the duration and the amount. So you could see that as a North Carolina specific issue that could be tough, especially for Tillis, but also for Trump. Otherwise, it's a national campaign, especially in the COVID era. And I wouldn't say that there's anything in particular that the Biden-Harris campaign should be focusing on in North Carolina.
Thank you for that, and I'm glad that you brought up the Senate race because in this state, because I wanted to get into that, and I'm also interested to hear what all of our panelists have to say on this. But we know historically sometimes it's harder for down-ticket races to get attention in the presidential year, and of course this year it's unprecedented presidentially because we have a president the likes of which we've never seen, and we've got COVID, and the world is in such chaos that it seems like even here in North Carolina there hasn't been much that we've heard about the Tillis-Cunningham race. So do you think that helps the incumbent more than it does Cunningham, or with the issues you've just mentioned that Tillis is kind of maybe got to hold the bucket for, does that put him in more trouble? What do you think of that race?
I think the recent patterns would suggest that the Senate race will track the presidential race, that if it's a good year for Democrats, if Biden wins, Cunningham's going to win. If Trump wins in North Carolina, probably Tillis will win, even though for Tillis, his polling numbers, it's hard to say who's ahead, but Tillis's are very low for an incumbent. I think the latest Fox poll had him at 42%. That's a heavy lift. Trump may be able to lift him on up if Trump gets some momentum going. But I think both Tillis and Cunningham, that race is so dependent on what the presidential pattern sets. The governor's race is somewhat different. People think of that differently. But the Senate race, I think you really have a generic Republican running against a generic Democrat in many respects. And that's why you don't see much advantage. There are lots of ads, but they seem to, in my mind, counteract and counterbalance each other. And I think the Senate race, you'll watch for the presidential race to help determine that.
Sure. Professor Aldrich, anything to add to that?
Yeah, a couple of things. So in 2000, it's analogous a little bit to 2008. We had the same set of circumstances, all three races up, all three races competitive. And what you noticed was that each of the races added a little bit of individual contribution to, in this case, it was in all three cases, the Democratic side, increased turnout slightly on the Democratic side and provided something unique. And it actually, so the gubernatorial and senatorial races in 2008 helped put Obama over the top, but Obama helped put the gubernatorial and the senatorial races over the top, and so on. And it's very similar this way. Another way in which it's quite similar to 2008 is we have this, we had the economic crisis of 2008 that tended to dominate the set of issues. Here we have the pandemic, and we have racial justice, and we have economic concerns. All these sort of genuine three-based pandemic is sort of dominating everything, and so there's a lot of similarities between those two cases, and I imagine it being extremely close. It's pretty unlikely that that Trump will carry the state by a lot. It's pretty unlikely that Biden will carry the state by a lot. And so very close numbers of small things will make a difference in both the senatorial and potentially the gubernatorial race, but especially the senatorial, I think.
Sure. Professor Rose, any further perspective to share on that one?
I think just a small thing to sort of riff off of what Professor Aldrich just said about the small things really mattering. I was paying attention recently to a little bit of a debate about mask wearing that emerged after Senator Tillis was spotted at President Trump's RNC nomination acceptance event at the White House, not wearing a mask. And so that really launched a really fascinating back and forth over social media between 𝐓𝐶 𝐏𝐚𝐬 and Senator Tillis. Senator Tillis actually, expressed some regret about not having worn a mask when he was surrounded by 1,000 people in close confines. And so I think this is one of those situations where those small things really could make a difference. And I think we're seeing both candidates recognizing that, and they're not taking anything for granted. So I think they're trying to really tread carefully across a lot of the delicate issues, especially related to COVID-19.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you very much. Professor Aldrich, I'd like to come back to you. We talked about polling, and as we said at the beginning, polling was criticized heavily in 2016, and yet when you look at the polling of the national numbers, it was actually fairly accurate. But then, of course, Trump won the presidency while losing the popular vote. So when we look at polling this year, should we be digging deeper and looking at it specifically through an electoral college lens, because the actual national numbers might not be what influences the final result?
It's certainly the case that it is, for a Trump victory would look, he might win straight out on the popular vote, but it's about 50-50 for a Trump win that he would lose the popular vote and win the electoral college. So yes, we need to get beneath that. The problem with 2016 wasn't the national popular vote, as you pointed out. It was getting accurate projections of what's going to happen at the individual state level. Those polls are often done by very different people for very different purposes, and they're often done with much less investment of resources to have a high quality poll. So they're likely to be wildly off, much more so than in a national poll. And that's why it's hard to look at that. You need to look at that as only a tiny piece of a lot of other factors. As we are talking about North Carolina, we need to look at, how many people have newly registered, how many, what's going on in the other major races in the state, and all these things together that are going to combine to be able to forecast and why it's so very difficult to forecast state by state. And it's just a very hard thing. And so it's going to leave election night and perhaps election week, as we count the votes over a longer period of time, with a great deal of uncertainty for lots of offices, the presidency, but also Senate, House, state legislative races. State legislatures are really important this year. And we'll, those will be one of the last to be figured out all the way through.
Thank you very much. And I appreciate you bringing up state legislatures, because Professor McCorkle, I wanted to ask you about that. Longtime observers of this state will know that back in 2000, when the state legislatures flipped and went Republican, then of course the Republicans got to redraw the maps based on the 2000 census. Mm-hmm. And since then we've moved more into what the courts have ruled is kind of gerrymandered districts. How important is this election at the state level, given that we're having another census of some sort? And maps, I guess, will be redrawn once again. Is there any chance that either of the chambers will flip back to Democratic, or are we going to look at Republicans drawing the maps again? And should we expect more legal maneuvering over what kind of election maps we have in this state?
Well, good, very good question. The hyper gerrymandering that we saw from the Republicans has been somewhat remedied by by recent court decisions at the state level, so that in the congressional districts, you had a situation where the Republicans were at a 10-3 advantage. Most people now think by the district maps that have been redrawn, it'll be 8-5 at least that Democrats will pick up 2 seats. The congressional 8th district is also a close race. So it's been somewhat remedied, the hyper gerrymandering, but it still exists. And you're exactly right. If the Republicans hold on to the House and Senate, they will get to draw the maps. It'll be under much heavier court supervision than before, but still they'll be able to draw the maps. I think the best hope for the Democrats at the state level is a big Cooper victory. If you think about how people will vote, they'll vote in the federal races, and then they'll vote for Governor Cooper. He might, regardless of what's happening at the federal level, if he wins big, that could send a trend that really helps Democrats. The problem for the Democrats is that where they need to pick up seats in the state legislature is not, they've already captured the cities. They're doing well in the Wake and Mecklenburg counties outside Raleigh and Charlotte, the big cities. It's not just in the rural white vote that their Democrats have trouble, but it's in the exurban county votes. The places that are metropolitan, but are outside of Charlotte. For instance, the counties like Union and Cabarrus and Gaston, and in North Carolina, in Wake, Johnston and Franklin, in Alamance County near us, near Guilford, in between Guilford and here. So that those are the areas that Democrats have to turn, and they're probably going to need a really strong performance for Governor Cooper to help give that momentum. But it's possible that at least one house would shift.
Thank you. Professor Rose, Professor Aldrich, any perspective on the gerrymandering or the chances of change at the state level here in the state this year?
So I think Professor McCorkle has it pretty much exactly right. It's possibly the hardest of the major polls for the Democratic Party is to carry one of the chambers. Should it get close? Should, as said, be a big vote for Cooper? It'd be a strong signal that the Republicans are going to be under close scrutiny, and they may as a result tend to narrow down their use of sort of pure gerrymandering. They, after 2010, they were really overt about it, and sort of proudly so. Having been caught by, in a sense, by the state courts, since the Supreme Court didn't choose to intervene in gerrymandering, particularly partisan gerrymandering. The states courts have that gives a check on the enthusiasm for which either party would be able to gerrymander in our state.
Thank you very much. Professor Rose, I'd like to come to you next. You study racial justice issues, and of course, this has been an unprecedented year in that area besides COVID and the chaos from the White House. Do you have any sense that the protests and the governmental response to it could be a factor in this election? And if so, how much?
Oh, absolutely, I do think so. I mean, I think that the fact that we live in an era where the media and social media provide an opportunity for people to actually have a new vantage point on what racial violence, racially related violence looks like. I feel like this, and perhaps it's also the fact that we're getting these images during the midst or in the midst of a pandemic when many of us are, we're a little closer to our social media feeds, to our phones, to our computers than we might otherwise be if we weren't sheltering in place in many cases. So I think that we're paying attention to these issues at a very high level. And I think that there is a great deal of frustration about the fact that we continually see the deaths of unarmed Black men, murders of unarmed Black men. It's almost a monthly occurrence. And I think we're seeing lawmakers who are increasingly vocal about the need for change. And we're seeing citizens recognize that, activism really is most useful when it translates into institutional change. And so they're expecting lawmakers to actually create some new policies or new efforts to address this challenge. So I do think this is something that we'll see factor into a lot of voting decisions. And yeah, I'm really interested to see how it turns out.
Absolutely, thank you. Professor McCorkle, we know obviously North Carolina's got a complicated racial history, just as the rest of the US does. Most of the big flashpoints this year and protests have taken place in other states. Do you see that at the state level as something that candidates are talking about, or they should be talking about, or that could influence results here?
Well, it's a very important factor in North Carolina. The base of the North Carolina Democrats is the minority vote, but the African American led minority vote, and that is the base of the party. So it's very important to address in North Carolina as it is in other states. And there were interesting signs right after the George Floyd murder in Waxhaw, North Carolina, which is a Republican place near Charlotte, suburb area of Charlotte. There was an overflow demonstration in favor of Black Lives Matter and George Floyd. If that even reflects a tick upward in terms of support for the Democrats in Union, I don't think that Democrats are going to win Union County, that exurban county outside of Charlotte. But if Republicans are held below 60% in those areas, it's going to be a big night for Democrats and real problems for Republicans. Now, after Kenosha, you saw some change in the polling numbers, more concern about Black Lives Matter because of the misassociation with some of the looting and violence that was going on in response to the horrible actions of the police in Kenosha. So it is an imponderable. Again, we'll have to see how it's working. There were clear signs, though, that it was helpful to the Democrats at first, early on. And in North Carolina, again, all that the Democrats really need to do in these exurban counties is get a little bit more competitive. So I've been watching for those kind of little signs, like what's happening in Waxhaw, North Carolina, and thinking that this may represent a real change.
Sure, absolutely. Professor Aldrich, I'm curious as to your take on it on the national level. President Trump has made it very clear where he stands. Do you think that helps him or hurts him, or how much of an issue do you think racial justice will be at the polls?
So it cuts both ways. Let me talk first about how it cuts in the Democratic advantage. Let's take Wisconsin as the example. In 2016, minority turnout was relatively low, particularly in Milwaukee. If Hillary Clinton had gotten the turnout that say President Obama had gotten in 2012, she would have carried Wisconsin. And we've just had a couple of studies come out to show that the presence of a demonstration has actually led to an increase in turnout among the minority communities being affected by the demonstrations. So that's on the one side. On the other side, the President Trump has the problem of how to motivate turnout in the rural areas of places like Wisconsin, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, between the two big cities, and so forth. And what has been used as the motivating force is fear. And so it lends the problems that have been associated with Kenosha that have been picked up by the Trump administration lend themselves to trying to generate fear as a part of turning out his own base, and not the unaffiliated or the potential Democrats. It's not swinging people from side to side. It's a question of which way does it motivate political action on election day.
Mm-hmm.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. Just like to remind everybody, you can ask questions directly into the Q&A window if you like, or raise your hand in Zoom if you would like to ask another question. But moving on, Professor Aldrich, I'd like to stay with you for a moment. There have been, because President Trump is an unprecedented president in a lot of ways, there have been several Republicans who have endorsed Joe Biden at the national level and at the state level. How much of a difference does that make? Do you get the impression that that is resonating with regular Republican voters?
Not particularly. It's not uncommon for there to be candidates of the other side. I mean, or politicians on the other side at conventions and that sort of thing. It does reinforce the sort of broader appeal, moderate Democrat appeal of Biden. Which is why those people were there. One of the exceptions actually is Romney, and not because he didn't endorse Biden, but what his actions are doing are reflecting Utah Republicans. Not that it's going to make a difference in who wins the state, but they were among the weakest supporters of on the Republican side of Trump in 2016. They're likely to be in 2020. They don't have the same candidate, third-party candidate to move towards, but that reflects among an important part of the Republican base that there are fundamental Christian beliefs that are sometimes overriding that, and that's the kind of thing that Romney has been resonating in the more general public.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. I'd like to get everybody's take on this. Professor McCorkle, I'll start with you. Yesterday, President Trump spoke in Wilmington and appeared to encourage people to vote twice. Obviously, we've become accustomed to him encouraging people or saying offhand remarks that don't seem to make a great deal of sense. Then, of course, the Attorney General, when asked about it, also said that he wasn't sure about the laws in each state. Do you think there was any kind of calculated intention behind that remark? Do you think it makes any difference to anything? What do you make of that?
I think it just continues President Trump's strategy of calculated chaos, might be the best phrase of just seeming as much as possible that a president can do to delegitimate the election, to raise questions, to raise uncertainty and doubt, which could make people not want to vote. That that's not so much as his trying to get his base out as maybe suppress or just have people not be confused about what's going on. So it was kind of vintage Trump, I thought, and I don't know that it will have resonance in and of itself, but it's just classic Trump of just trying to foment chaos, it seems to me.
Professor Rose, anything to add to that?
I mean, I would say that, seemingly offhanded remarks like that, could be, I think President Trump could say those things and assume that they really won't carry much weight. But I think that could be, that type of comment could be just another indicator to people who are really ready to move beyond this particular presidency, to remind them that they're looking for an adult in the room. They want to get back to at least some semblance of normalcy when it comes to governance and to leadership. So, if I were advising the Trump campaign, I would suggest that they refrain from those kinds of remarks because they don't send reminders that I think would work in their favor.
Sure, thank you. Professor Aldrich, Professor McCorkle mentioned that those comments were vintage Trump. And, in 2016, it seemed like it was hard to predict what was going to happen because Trump was the kind of candidate we'd never seen before. And certainly in the last 4 years, he's been the kind of president that we've never seen before, regardless of what people think of his performance. Does that kind of unprecedented nature and his kind of cavalier way with a lot of the way things are normally done in this country, does that mean that the normal rules, whether it comes to polling or the kind of things that we look at to expect what's going to happen, do they still really apply? Or is he such a chaos agent that to an extent you have to throw up your hands and say, well, we'll have to wait and see?
Yeah. So here's where I think of it. So we're now in the midst of the general election campaign. We have two candidates. They're supposed to be competing against each other. So we're supposed to see competition, and we're supposed to be saying why to vote for me and why not to vote and why not to vote for the opponent. That's fine. In a traditional year, like say from 1787 to 2016, this competition has been conducted in here's why you should vote for me. I'm the person who will make our democracy stronger. The Trump's approach is to say vote for me under any circumstances, even if I make democracy weaker, to be able to get a victory. And that's what I think makes him so concerning. These may be offhand comments. I think a lot of them are, instead of him having talking points where he has to say exactly the specific thing you do in most talking points, these are talking points that allow him to say, okay, I'm going to say something in that general area, and it's going to be wild and outrageous. But it's also designed not to preserve and protect and extend our democratic system, but to extend and to preserve and protect Trump's administration and Trump's election.
Sure, absolutely. We're going to wrap this up here shortly. I appreciate everybody joining us. One final thing I would like all of you to weigh in on. Obviously, because of COVID, there's a lot of talk about more mail-in ballots, more absentee ballots. There's been a controversy at the federal level about some defunding of the post office, removal of machines. Do you have any sense for the extent to which this is on voters' minds in North Carolina, or how much of an issue the disruption to the postal service has been in North Carolina, and what you expect to see in terms of in-person voting patterns versus mail-in ballots, and whether we could have some chaos on election day? What are your thoughts on that? Professor McCorkle, we'll start with you.
I fear we're going to see some chaos. Now, North Carolina has a pretty strong early voting system, and people can not just early vote, but can take their ballots to the early voting site, their mail-in ballots, and not even go inside. So that's one way to avoid going through the post office system. But I fear that on November 4th, on post day after election, things are going to be unclear, to say the least, and we're going to be waiting for a lot of mail-in ballots and a lot of confusion on that end. So I have a lot of fear that's going to be a big issue, not just in North Carolina, but nationally. And of course, in North Carolina, it's brought home a little bit because the new Postmaster General DeJoy is from Greensboro, and quite a big Republican fundraiser, and known in North Carolina political circles. So I'm very fearful of the problems and the uncertainty and perhaps even chaos that could result from bad mail service.
Professor Aldrich, what's your take on that situation?
Yeah, it seems to me there's two sources of two spots in which there be problems. One of them is the actual conduct of the election itself, and will people turn out? Will people be concerned about mail ballots? Will people be concerned about going to an election booth, to a voting precinct in the case of COVID? So that's a problem. The only advantage of having this long enough in advance is that organizations have been able to anticipate, and to some degree, including the state governments, how to address it. We've had a few trial runs to see how disastrous it could be. So at least we have a little bit of advantage of preparation. The second problem was, which Professor McCorkle was talking about, is what happens on election day and after, because it's very unlikely that all the ballots will be counted. Certainly by midnight of November 3rd, it's very unlikely to be known, at least all the results known. It's possible that the presidential race will be known if it goes one-sided, but it's pretty unlikely. There's certainly going to be close cases, and those are certainly going to take days, weeks, possibly even months to sort out. And if there's a lot of those, as could very well be the case, this is a really serious problem for people watching the unfolding of what seems like a third world election.
Thank you. Professor Rose, the last word to you.
Well, I would echo everything my colleagues have said, and just, stepping back a little bit from this election, I would just say that one of the major lessons that I'm taking, and that I'm sure we're taking more broadly as a society, is the need for major election reform, and to be ready for situations like this where, what we think we know, what we typically do in terms of elections and our processes, we need to work to shore them up, to make them ready for emergencies in the future, and perhaps to rethink the contemporary system for casting votes.
Absolutely. Thank you. And thank you, all three of our panelists, for that perspective. I think we will leave it there. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thanks again to our panelists, Deondra Rose, Mac McCorkle, and John Aldrich. As I mentioned at the beginning of this briefing, we'll be holding several briefings between now and the election on election issues, including voter suppression and the security of the election, and the day-to-day ongoing nature of the campaign. Our next briefing, however, will be on next Tuesday at 10 a.m. when we'll be discussing vigilantism in the context of the events in Kenosha. If you'd like to attend that event, please email dukenews@duke.edu. In the meantime, thank you for joining us. Please stay well and have a great day.